there are a lot of reasons to regard the candidacy of Bernie Sanders with optimism. There are a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons to be excited about the concept that the United States of America would finally catch up with Scotland, Taiwan, and Canada in providing cost-free healthcare to the poor, having cheaper tuition, all kinds of opportunities for the poorest 20% of the population. All kinds of reason to be optimistic about that. You wouldn't want that optimism to blind you to the important fact that this is somebody who made excuses for communist dictatorships all around the world from at least 1982 to 1989, would you? You wouldn't want to be the kind of person who says, oh no, it's not politically convenient for me to think about that. It's not politically convenient for me to know that, so I'm just going to pretend it isn't true. You wouldn't want to live a lie because it's politically in your self-interest to do so. No, that would make you just like all the people you disagree with and despise in politics, right? What if it's really important to have the maturity and the detachment to appreciate, what's promising about Bernie Sanders in his current campaign or what things he's right about, and to also have a kind of balanced, down-to-earth view about, what might be wrong with Bernie Sanders, past, present, and future. Does it matter? Does it matter in 2019 that Bernie Sanders used to make positive statements about communist dictatorships around the world? Does it matter that in 1988 he chose to go for his honeymoon vacation with his newly wedded wife to the Soviet Union and to say positive things about the Soviet Union? It matters. It tells you something about it. Bernie Sanders claims he cares about the poor, uplifting the poor. In that decade, the decade of the 1980s, what were the most successful countries in the world at lifting the poor out of poverty? Japan, South Korea. Those countries were totally devastated in World War II. Right? Some areas bombed to being just a parking lot. And they rose up out of that devastation and created educational opportunities for their people and economic opportunities for their people. It's the era of what was normally called the economic miracle in Japan and in South Korea both. This kind of language is... Someone with Bernie Sanders, his political agenda, might have developed a fascination with and an appreciation for what had happened in Japan in the decade of the 1980s. And he didn't. Could have been Singapore, could have been South Korea, could have been Denmark, Sweden, or Norway, but it wasn't. The political and economic examples that interested Bernie Sanders were Cuba, Nicaragua, and the Soviet Union, aka Russia. That was what he was interested in emulating, learning from, and praising. And none of those countries, none of them, were successfully helping to alleviate the poor, were lifting the poor out of poverty. None of them had a record remotely as impressive as Japan during the same period of time. Now, Japan had its own political problems, but Japan did very fundamentally have freedom of the press, democracy. Their democracy was a direct imitation of the American system of democracy in that period. Their constitution was written by members of the American military. It's a really funny story. That's how things were wrapped up in Japan after World War II. Hey, you know what? It could have been West Germany in the same period also, all right? And if that were the case, we'd be sitting around saying, boy, Bernie Sanders, he's a weird guy. He really spent the 1980s traveling back and forth to Japan and studying like maybe the automotive industry in Japan and saying, hey, look, the automotive industry in Japan is booming at the same time it's collapsed in the United States, and looking at how the Japanese provide their people with health care and, how maybe he would have learned some things from that, and we'd have a very different perspective on the autobiographical portion of this book today. Here's the other thing. If we are to believe the convenient myth that he made excuses for communism in Cuba, Nicaragua, and the Soviet Union only during the decade of the 1980s, and he certainly had changed his tune by 1991, a book like this would be a really good opportunity for him to do some soul searching and to say how wrong he was in his youth and how different his perspective is today. And you guys know, he wasn't exactly young in the 1980s. I was. I remember my perspective and my debates with my parents about a lot of those issues, you know, from that period. I was a kid. Instead, the only admission of the extent to which he was involved with justifying, supporting, and visiting these communist countries here, you get just a couple sentences saying that he established a sister city program linking the town he was mayor of to one town in the Soviet Union and one town in Nicaragua, and that those programs still endure to this day. So that to me is very different from reading the perspective of someone who really tells you that, hey, during a certain period of his life, he was a socialist and he was a communist, and then he realized something and he really changed his perspective. If your fundamental agenda is helping the poor, if your fundamental agenda is improving healthcare, if your fundamental agenda is improving education, then you would go to and examine the countries that have the best education system in the world, the education system that works the best for poor people, the best education at low rates of tuition. You would visit the countries in the world that have the best healthcare systems in the world. You would visit the countries that really had the best economies, that had lifted the poor out of poverty, or where they had almost zero unemployment. Hint, hint, Japan. It's still true of Japan today to a remarkable extent, but Japan in the 1980s, you're talking about 2% unemployment, 2.5%. It was so unnerving to the Americans that there's still this myth circulating in the newspapers that the Japanese do the math for the unemployment rate in an unfair way. Like, oh, no, they're cheating. They're not cheating. I've looked into it. I studied the economics of Japan University. No, it's real. The 2.5% unemployment in the 1980s, it's real. The success of their automotive industry, it was real. Bernie Sanders lived through it. Was he interested? No. He was buying himself an airplane ticket to Nicaragua and making excuses for that regime. He was buying himself an airplane ticket to the Soviet Union and so on. And, people want to let him off the hook by using this term socialist. What happened to socialists in the Soviet Union? Do you know this? The year 1917 is the year of the revolution, meaning the Bolshevik Revolution. There's more than one revolution in the history of Russia, and they're kind of clustered uncomfortably close together. 1917, okay. They had elections. You can find that out on Wikipedia. It was really hard to find that out in the Soviet Union back when the commies controlled the education system. And you know who won the elections? It wasn't the Bolsheviks. It was the socialists. You may think now, from the perspective of 2019, that the difference between socialist and communist is like the difference between chocolate and chocolate chip. But it's not. What happened after the Bolsheviks lost the elections was that they hunted down and murdered every single member of the Socialist Party in the whole country. Every single person who was elected to parliament, all the winners in their parliament, were hunted down and murdered in the most brutal way imaginable. And we have a lot of witnesses to that history, because many of the members of parliament themselves and many of their supporters, the socialists who got way more votes and way more seats than the Bolsheviks by far, a lot of them fled step by step ever further east out towards Siberia. A lot of them didn't make it as far as Siberia. It's a huge country from east to west. They were hunted down and died as the Russian Civil War went on. If you were a socialist, if you were a democratic socialist, as Bernie Sanders described himself, you would have more reason than anyone else to utterly despise the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was a country founded on hunting down and killing people like you. People with precisely your political ideology. Instead, what Bernie Sanders was, in the parlance of postmodern communism, he was a fellow traveler. He was someone who got along with and supported communists without really being explicitly a communist himself. I say again, there's every reason to regard the candidacy of Bernie Sanders as a positive and hopeful thing for the future of the United States of America. His past political beliefs matter. You can't be any more morally pure than the people you make excuses for. If you made excuses in support of the Soviet Union, in support of Fidel Castro in Cuba, it matters.